They say true strength is often silent and dignity needs no spotlight. In a small-town diner where laughter once came at an old man's expense, a single act of kindness uncovered a story long forgotten. A story of sacrifice, of courage, and of a hero who never asked to be remembered. Stay with me as we journey through this moment, because sometimes the quietest men carry the loudest truths. If this story touches you, don't forget to follow, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every word matters, and we read them all. The bell above the door jingled softly as the cold morning air slipped inside. Howard Mason stepped into the diner, careful with each movement as if he did not want to disturb anyone. His coat was clean but frayed at the edges, his hands cracked and rough from years of work, and his back carried a quiet bend that revealed both age and time's weight. The diner wasn't busy that morning. A few regulars sat at their booths, sipping coffee, murmuring in low tones that felt almost protective of the silence. Howard paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the warm light that spilled from the ceiling lamps, then walked steadily to the far end of the counter. His steps weren't rushed, nor were they on slow, just steady, like a man who had walked through winters before. The vinyl stool squeaked beneath him as he sat down. From the pocket of his worn coat, he pulled out a folded napkin. His movements were careful, almost ceremonial, as if the act carried more weight than the object itself. He unwrapped it slowly to reveal coins, quarters, dimes, a few nickels, and even some scattered pennies. With quiet precision, he began lining them up one by one on the counter. The waitress approached, chewing gum lazily. She was in her mid-40s, her notepad tucked beneath one arm, her face carved with the kind of lines that came from long hours rather than smiles. She didn't bother with a greeting. "Coffee?" she asked flatly. Howard gave a small nod. "And maybe some eggs and toast, if this covers it." His voice was gentle, the kind of tone that asked permission even when making the smallest request. Her eyes slid down to the neat rows of coins. She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "We're not a donation center, you know." Howard didn't argue. His fingers kept moving, one coin at a time, each landing with a soft clink that seemed to echo louder than it should have. He was used to that kind of response. Dismissal, irritation, the quick assumption that a man counting coins must also be counting his worth. In a booth not far away, two young customers leaned toward one another. One of them smirked, his voice just loud enough to carry. "If you've got to count change just to eat, maybe stay home." His friend chuckled, not even pretending to lower his tone. Their laughter filled the space with something sharp, cutting into the quiet like glass breaking. Howard heard it. Of course he did, but he said nothing. His hands slowed slightly, though, the coins moving in smaller, hesitant motions. He kept his gaze fixed on the counter, refusing to let his eyes rise, because sometimes looking up cost more than a man could afford. The waitress sighed and turned away. The diner seemed to lean into a strange hush, that uneasy silence when everyone knows something isn't right, but no one wants to be the one to say it. Howard checked the coins again, stacking them neatly, pushing the napkin aside as if to give the counter more room. When the waitress returned, she set the mug of coffee down harder than necessary, and some of it sloshed over the edge. Howard gave a nod anyway. "Thank you," he murmured. She didn't respond. Instead, she counted the coins herself, quick and efficient, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're short by 40 cents. Howard reached back into his pocket, searching, but came up with only lint. His hesitation showed in the tremor of his hand. I could take just the toast then." The waitress folded her arms. "Look, sir, I've got paying customers. I'm not running a shelter here." From the booth nearby, the young man chuckled again. Maybe he's practicing for a part. Local grandpa learns the value of $1. His girlfriend laughed too, louder this time, loud enough that Howard couldn't mistake who the joke was about. Howard's hand trembled as he lifted the mug, careful not to spill. He took a sip. No sugar, no cream, just hot, bitter coffee. He lowered it back onto the counter, the cup landing with a sound that seemed too heavy for porcelain. The diner grew quieter still, as though the air itself was listening. Some heads turned, others deliberately looked away. Howard tried to return one slice of toast that had already been plated, his voice soft. "I really don't mind. Just the coffee that was enough." The waitress opened her mouth to respond, annoyance rising, when a new sound cut through, the low creak of the diner door opening again. The bell above jingled once more as the cold slipped in with another customer. Howard did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the coins, on the napkin, on the empty space in front of him. But the room felt different. It was as though everyone had turned at once, watching the newcomer. The couple who had laughed suddenly grew quiet, their smirk dimming into something less certain. Howard sat still, unaware of the shift. His world in that moment was no larger than the coffee in his hand and the coins that no longer added up. He believed the morning would end with hunger and humiliation, the kind that clung to a man long after he left the room. What he didn't know, not yet, was that someone else had entered who would change the meaning of everything. Not just the meal, not just the moment, but the story of his life that had been left unspoken for far too long. The coins sat neatly in rows, a silent testament to struggle, when a voice, steady and calm, was about to cut through the weight of shame. "I'll cover it." The words came from behind, firm but not loud, the kind of voice that didn't ask, it decided. The diner turned toward the sound, even the clatter of dishes from the kitchen seemed to pause. A man in a gray hoodie stepped forward, the single word Marine stitched across his chest. His stride carried no rush, no hesitation, only a steady calm born from discipline. He pulled a black wallet from his back pocket and slid a card across the counter toward the waitress. "You sure?" she asked, caught off guard by the suddenness of it. The Marine gave a single nod. No smile, no request for thanks, just a quiet certainty that ended the matter. The young couple in the booth stiffened. The girl lowered her eyes to her phone as if ashamed, while the boy leaned back, arms crossed, trying to disguise the heat rising to his face. Their laughter died as quickly as it had begun. Howard lifted his gaze for the first time, startled, confusion pulling at his features. "I didn't ask him to," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "You didn't have to." The Marine looked at him only for a brief moment, his eyes steady but not unkind. "Add some eggs and sausage," he told the waitress before moving toward the window booth. He sat down, turned his face to the falling snow outside, and said nothing more. No one else in the diner spoke. The waitress, still blinking in surprise, scribbled the order onto her notepad and disappeared into the kitchen. A subtle shift lingered in the room, an unspoken awareness that something ordinary had just bent towards something rare. Howard lowered his eyes again, but this time it wasn't from shame. His gaze fell on the full plate the waitress returned with, eggs steaming, sausage browned, toast golden. The smell carried him back, though he couldn't place when. It had been years since a plate like this was set in front of him. Years since someone decided without question that he deserved more than the bare minimum. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the fork. He wasn't used to kindness landing in front of him so directly, so without condition. He took a small bite, slow and deliberate, chewing not from hunger alone but from the heaviness lodged in his chest. It wasn't just food on the plate, it was dignity returned to him, without words, without judgment. The waitress came back with fresh cream and sugar, setting them beside his cup without the rolling eyes or sharp tone from earlier. She didn't speak, but her hand lingered for a second longer than usual, as if the act itself was an apology she didn't know how to voice. Howard nodded, grateful, but he didn't use the cream or sugar yet. His attention drifted toward the Marine sitting by the window. The man sat with a stillness that felt familiar, not from recognition of a face, but from recognition of posture. The way a man carries himself after years of discipline, after years of waiting in silence when the world moves too loudly. Howard lifted another forkful of eggs, then another sip of coffee. The warmth spread through him, not only in body but in spirit, a small reminder that kindness, once given, had the power to change the shape of an entire morning. And then, as if the moment were no more than a passing breath, the Marine was gone. His booth sat empty, a half-finished cup of coffee steaming faintly on the table, the condensation curling upward in lazy threads. No one had seen him leave. No one had heard the door. Howard looked toward the empty seat, then back to his own plate. A silence pressed on him, not of embarrassment now, but of wonder. He wanted to say something, to understand why, but there was no one left to answer. The waitress returned again, her voice lower, softer than before. She refilled his coffee and placed a receipt on the counter. It was already stamped, already marked paid in full. He said to tell you, no thanks necessary. Howard blinked, his fork resting midair. He glanced back at the booth again, but it remained empty. The Marine's presence lingered like an echo, leaving behind only a half-empty cup and a ripple that spread across the entire diner. The young couple who had mocked him earlier avoided his eyes now. The boy stared at this blank screen of his phone, pretending to scroll, his shoulders tight with shame. The girl tugged at her sleeve nervously, her smirk long gone. Howard took another bite, this time slower, as though giving himself permission to feel full, not just in his stomach, but in his chest where the weight of loneliness had lived for too many years. He stirred cream into his cup, lifted it carefully, and allowed himself to sit straighter on the stool. He didn't look for recognition. He didn't expect more. But for the first time in a long while, the silence around him didn't feel like absence. It felt like space, room enough for him to breathe, to remember, and perhaps to hope. Somewhere deep inside, though he didn't yet realize it, this moment was only the beginning. What had started as a simple gesture of kindness was about to open a door to a part of his past he thought the world had long since forgotten. Howard's eyes fell to the plate again, to the napkin he had once filled with coins. He folded it carefully and set it aside, no longer needed for payment, but still a habit too old to break. His fingers lingered on the soft creases of the fabric. The diner's usual hum began to return, forks tapping plates, low conversations humming in the background. But everything felt different now, lighter somehow. Howard finished his coffee, still turning the moment over in his mind, wondering at the Marine's silence, at the absence of pride in his voice, at the quiet certainty of someone who had stepped in without asking for anything in return. And though Howard did not yet know it, that same Marine was not finished with him. The story was not over. Soon the man in the gray hoodie would return, carrying more than a wallet, carrying something Howard had left behind more than 2 decades ago. If this story has touched you so far, remember to follow, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every word matters. We read them all. The bell above the diner door jingled again, the soft sound almost swallowed by the steady murmur of voices and clinking cutlery. Howard looked up, expecting another stranger stepping in from the cold. His eyes widened slightly when he saw the man who had paid for his meal returning, the gray hoodie with Marines stitched across the chest unmistakable. This time, the Marine didn't head toward the window booth. He walked straight to Howard's table, his footsteps measured, his face calm. He stopped just beside the counter stool where Howard sat and asked in a low, steady voice, "You're Sergeant Howard Mason, right?" The title landed like a weight on the air. Howard froze, his fork halfway to his plate. He blinked, his lips parting slightly as though the word itself had knocked something loose inside him. "I haven't used that title in a long time," he said, his voice rougher than before. The Marine gave a single nod. "My father did." Howard tilted his head, puzzled. "I'm sorry?" From his back pocket, the Marine pulled out an old, creased photograph. He placed it gently on the counter in front of Howard. The black and white image was grainy, dust and smoke blurring the edges. Shadows of men crouched behind a smoking Humvee, rifles clutched, helmets low. And in the center, faint but unmistakable, was a younger Howard Mason. His arms were locked under another man's vest, dragging him across sand while shielding his body with his own. Howard's eyes fixed on the photo. His breath caught, and his hand trembled as he picked it up. "I remember this," he whispered, voice cracking. "That was Iraq, Fallujah. We were ambushed near a radio tower." His thumb brushed the corner of the paper, as if trying to bring the image into sharper focus. The Marine pointed at the wounded figure in the photo. "That was my father." Howard's mouth opened slightly, shock hollowing his voice. He studied the face again, blurred though it was. Recognition came slowly, painfully. "Lieutenant Carson, he took shrapnel to the leg." Howard shook his head faintly. "I didn't think he made it." "He did," the Marine said quietly. "Because of you. You pulled him out under fire, saved his life." Howard leaned back on the stool, stunned. The diner around him faded into a blur, every sound dulled beneath the pounding of memory. That was over 20 years ago. The Marine's gaze held steady. I was 9. I remember when he came home, limping, scarred, but alive. Every birthday, he told me the story. Said if I ever met you, I'd know. Howard looked down again at the photo, the younger version of himself caught in a frozen moment of chaos. His throat tightened. I didn't do it for recognition. I know, the Marine replied. His voice softened just enough to reveal something beyond discipline. That's why it mattered. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them thickened with the weight of what had been revealed. One man who had given, one who had received, finally meeting across decades of silence. There were no speeches, no applause, no spectacle. Just two men, bound by a memory carved into sand and fire, standing now in the quiet of a small-town diner. I thought I'd never get the chance, the Marine added after a pause. His words carried both relief and gravity. To say thank you. Howard reached across the counter, his eyes glassy but proud, and extended his hand. His voice broke slightly when he answered. You just did. From the booth nearby, the young man who had mocked Howard earlier shifted uncomfortably. His girlfriend whispered, Did you hear that? He nodded, but his arms folded across his chest as though he wished he could vanish into the seat. His phone screen stayed black in his hand, the performance of distraction hollow now. The waitress had heard too. She stood a little ways off, her notepad forgotten in her hand. She stepped closer, her voice softer than it had been all morning. I didn't know, she admitted, about who you were. Howard gave a small shrug, a weary but genuine gesture. Most people don't. I never mentioned it. From the back of the diner, another voice rose, older and lined with familiarity. An older man stood up, wearing a faded American Legion jacket, his limp subtle but unmistakable. He looked across the room. Howard Mason. Howard turned, surprised. Yes, sir? The man approached slowly, his eyes shining with recognition. I served out of Kandahar the year after you left. Heard your name more than once. He extended his hand, and Howard shook it, the grip steady, the silence between them heavy with respect. Another customer stood, then another. A woman joined, then two more men. One by one, they came forward. Not in a rush, not loud or dramatic, but quietly, each placing a hand on Howard's shoulder or offering a nod of gratitude. The diner shifted again, the air no longer tinged with mockery, but with reverence. What had begun as humiliation now transformed into recognition, the quiet unveiling of a man's worth that had been overlooked for far too long. Howard sat still, the photo still clutched between his fingers, his heart pounding with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Pride, not the boastful kind, but the kind that settled deep, steady, and unshakable. The Marine remained by his side, silent now, but his presence was enough. The weight of memory, the burden of forgotten service, had been returned to the light. And for the first time in decades, Howard realized that the world had not forgotten entirely. Someone remembered, and that knowledge alone was enough to change everything. The diner's atmosphere had shifted entirely. Where silence once carried judgment, it now carried reverence. Patrons who had looked away earlier leaned forward, drawn into the weight of what had just unfolded. Howard sat at the counter, his hands still resting on the faded photo, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that betrayed both pride and disbelief. The owner stepped out from the back, a broad man with a white apron stretched across his frame. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Howard with a mixture of recognition and respect. Wiping his hands on the apron, he approached carefully, his voice steady but carrying something deeper. Sergeant Mason, he said, the title deliberate, his tone respectful. If you ever want to eat here again, it's on the house, every time. Howard looked up, startled, his brows furrowed, his mouth parting slightly. I can't accept that, he said softly. You've already done enough. The owner shook his head, his voice firm. Some of us just forgot what service looks like. He glanced toward the empty wall near the counter, the space usually cluttered with flyers for pie specials and football games. He lifted his hand, pointing. I'd like to put that photo up there, the one of you pulling that soldier to safety. We'll frame it with your name. Howard didn't answer immediately. His eyes followed the owner's gesture, landing on the bare wall. For years, his name had been absent from conversations, absent from memory. And now here was a chance not just to be seen, but to be remembered, not with pity, but with pride. His throat tightened, words catching before they could form. The Marine remained quiet beside him, watching, but his steady presence said more than words could. Later that evening, Howard returned to his small apartment above the hardware store. The walls were nearly bare, except for a single shelf holding a few worn paperbacks and one faded photo in a wooden frame, a younger Howard in uniform, standing beside a Humvee, the dust and sun of war etched across his face. He sat at his desk, pulling open the top drawer. Inside rested a small box. He lifted the lid carefully, revealing service medals scratched and dulled by time. A bent dog tag near the clasp, memories he had hidden away rather than displayed. For years he had told himself they no longer mattered, that the past could stay buried. After the fire that had taken his home and most of his possessions, it had been easier to let go than to cling to what little remained. From his coat pocket, Howard pulled out the napkin the Marine had left behind at the diner. Still folded neatly, still blank. He held it between his fingers, a simple piece of fabric, but it carried meaning he couldn't explain. Some habits never died. The folding, the counting, the quiet rituals of survival. He placed the napkin inside the box with the medals, closed the lid, and locked it. Then he leaned back, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. For the first time in years, he felt full, not just from a meal, but from the knowledge that someone had remembered. The following week, the diner changed. The wall near the counter, once crowded with advertisements and notices, now held a framed photo, the same one the Marine had placed in Howard's hands. Beneath it, a plaque gleamed. Sergeant Howard Mason, for service that asked nothing but gave everything. Patrons stopped to look. Some asked questions, others stood quietly, taking in the image of a man they had overlooked before. Howard never drew attention to it. He still came in most mornings, still sat at the same counter stool. He counted his coins out of habit, not necessity now, and though the staff refused his money, he always left 2 quarters beneath his mug before walking out. A quiet nod to the moment when everything had changed. The young couple who had mocked him that morning never returned. In their place came new faces, people who had heard the story. Parents leaned down to whisper to their children as they passed the photo. He's the one who pulled that soldier out. He's the one who paid for his meal without asking for thanks. Howard never corrected them. He only smiled when they nodded at him, carrying his silence with dignity. Recognition had never been the goal. But being remembered, being respected, that was something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, the diner became more than a place for coffee and meals. It became a place where Howard's story lived on, told not with speeches, but with quiet gestures, with a framed photo, with the nods of strangers who now saw him differently. The laughter that had once been at his expense was replaced by silence that spoke louder than words, a silence filled with respect. And in that small-town diner, where once he had been dismissed, Howard Mason's presence became a reminder that sometimes the strongest men are not the ones who speak the loudest, but the ones who carry their weight in silence. A reminder that sacrifice does not fade just because time has passed. A reminder that dignity, once restored, has the power to change not only a man, but an entire community. Howard continued his routine: coffee, toast, the quiet ritual of coins left behind. But within him, something had shifted permanently. For years, he had believed he was invisible. And now he knew that even the smallest acts, a folded napkin, a Marine's quiet intervention, a framed photo on a wall, could carry the weight of a lifetime of service. Because sometimes being remembered is more than enough. Howard's story leaves us with a truth worth carrying. Respect should never wait until a man is gone. Gratitude belongs in the present, where it can heal, where it can restore, where it can remind us all of what service truly means. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who gave quietly and never asked to be remembered, share their name in the comments. And if you believe dignity doesn't need a spotlight, follow us and subscribe for more stories like Howard's. We tell them because someone must.